Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about food safety. Basically, with food safety, as far as the regulation goes, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Department of Agriculture, or USDA, monitor most of the food that is in the United States food supply. In recent years, with the Food Safety Modernization Act, they have taken steps to try to ensure that the safety of products produced internationally are of the same standards of the food that is produced in the US to keep the United States food supply safe. So, just excuse me 1 second. In talking about food safety, it's done to prevent foodborne illnesses. So, first, we'll talk a little bit about what a foodborne illness actually is. So, symptoms can include gastroenteritis, nausea, abdominal cramps, diarrhea, and vomiting. Sometimes you have all of these situations or symptoms happening all at one time. For example, if anyone has experienced norovirus or you know someone that has had norovirus, you have pretty intense vomiting and diarrhea happening at the same time for typically almost a week. And many times you need to go to the hospital to have an IV to replace all the fluid loss. So we are all susceptible to foodborne illnesses, but there are certain populations that are more highly susceptible, and the FDA has named these populations as the highly susceptible populations. They are the on the slide it says the very young, the old, and compromised immune system. So basically it's the elderly, children, and people with compromised immune systems. And many of the, especially the bacterial illnesses can be inactivated by proper cooking. So again, here's just a quick recap of the types of foodborne hazards. We have the biological, the chemical, and the physical. So the physical is probably the most straightforward and pretty easy to detect. But they could also be, there's a more immediate danger perhaps than the others, even though some of the bacteria can kill you. Eating glass, consuming pieces of bone fragment or pieces of metal or plastics are all very dangerous, and depending on the size and shape of this physical contaminant, many different types of uh, injuries or bodily harm can happen to you. So it could be as simple as a piece of bone that got into your ground beef burger. So when you bite into it, you can chip a tooth, all the way down to ingesting glass that, once it gets into your digestive tract, can cause all kinds of problems, whatever you can imagine. So let's go back over to the biological. These are the bacteria, molds, viruses, prions, which are a protein-like virus. It's similar to a virus. We also have chemical hazards, which are plant toxins, animal toxins, and agricultural and industrial chemicals. So that's basically your fertilizers and cleaning chemicals. Your biological hazards are naturally occurring. Again, those are your bacteria, molds, viruses, parasites. Now, the slide discusses the top 3 responsible for the highest number of illnesses in the United States, and they have them listed as Campylobacter, norovirus, and Salmonella. They are not in the particular order of occurrence, because norovirus is number one. Norovirus has been for many years the most common foodborne illness. It's very easily spread. If one person has it, it's easy to spread to numerous people in a very short amount of time. Luckily, if you could say luckily, the duration of the illness is relatively short. So you can feel very ill for a very short time, but then you get better. Whereas something like Clostridium botulinum, if the botulinum toxin builds up in your system and you do not treat it in time, it could lead to paralysis and death. So that's very rare, but very severe. Norovirus is very common, but for the average person, you're going to be miserable, absolutely miserable for 5 to 10 days. But after that, you should be okay. And norovirus is what you see oftentimes as the cause for cruise ships that pull into a port and the ship is under quarantine and no one is allowed to get off of the ship because 75+% of the ship has norovirus and everyone is vomiting on each other and has diarrhea, and there's just a breakdown of the systems on the ship and there's no way to control it. So more often than I'm sure anyone would like to admit, there have been these issues of norovirus outbreaks on cruise ships. So again, there's how each one of these pathogens affects us or gets into our bodies. The mechanism is a little bit different. We have infections, we have intoxications or poisoning, and then we have toxin-mediated infections. So I'm going to go over a little bit of these right now. So your infections, that will be Salmonella, Listeria monocytogenes, Yersinia enterocolitica, and Shigella. Your intoxications are Clostridium perfringens, Staphylococcus aureus, and Clostridium botulinum. So it's the toxin produced by perfringens or botulinum or Staph aureus that once it produces the toxin, then you're going to get sick. The truth is, we all ingest Clostridium botulinum spores all the time because they're commonly found in soil. So in the room that you're sitting in right now, no matter how clean it is, especially if you're by a window and there's a breeze blowing in, there's going to be Clostridium botulinum spores in the air. But they're spores, so it's a hardened coat and they're dormant. So we'll ingest the spores, they'll pass through our digestive tract, and we will excrete the spores still intact. The issue is in products that are anaerobic, and if you think back to probably 5th grade science, anaerobic means without oxygen. So if these spores are in an anaerobic environment, as in a canned food, or even if you have garlic and oil, like a lot of restaurants like to do, where you have your olive oil with fresh garlic at the bottom, if that's in there for long enough and at a high enough temperature, there's an opportunity for botulinum spores to germinate and activate. Basically, they shed that protective coating, they're ready to party, and they start producing the botulinum toxin. So if you ingest that toxin, you're going to get sick. You'll be very ill. And then we have toxin-mediated infections. That's your E. coli, Campylobacter, Vibrio. So the main Vibrios that we're concerned with, especially as they relate to shellfish, in particular is Vibrio parahemolyticus, which is common in this region of the United States at this temperature. So basically it's in your bay area. So not such a high salinity as the ocean, but more brackish, like the bay water has. It's salt water, but it's not as high of a salinity. And the fact that the depth is usually more shallow, it allows the water to heat up so that the heat produces, it's the perfect stew for the Vibrio parahemolyticus to grow. Not as common, but still occurring in this region of the United States is Vibrio vulnificus. And that is similar to parahemolyticus, but the difference with Vibrio vulnificus is you can still get sick if you have a cut on your hand or a cut on your foot or anywhere in your body, on your body that's exposed to the water that has a high enough load of Vibrio vulnificus. You can still get sick. So parahemolyticus is more related to consumption of your raw oysters, and Vibrio vulnificus in this region is probably more related to the water. So you might have been shucking oysters or cleaning crabs, and you cut your hand, and then you get Vibrio vulnificus into your blood, and you get a blood infection. And if you have the right or wrong set of pre-existing conditions, it's possible that you can die from this. Vibrio vulnificus is more apparent, it's more common in the Gulf of Mexico, so southern water that has a warmer temperature throughout the calendar year. Okay, again, we're talking about bacterial food infections. We have Listeria monocytogenes, or LM. This one is scary because it grows at refrigeration temperatures. So if you have ever worked in food service and your restaurant date marked food to be discarded, it's usually date marked to be discarded within 7 days if you're holding it for more than 24 hours. And it's that 7-day discard is due to Listeria monocytogenes. The FDA actually calls the 7-day hold the LM rule. So once a product that requires refrigeration, if it's going to be held for more than 24 hours, you label it to be discarded after that 7 days. And that's because it can grow during refrigerated temperatures. So very scary. This one in particular scared me, or made me realize how serious these illnesses could be. I remember when I was taking NUFD 240 many years ago, and at that time the course was based on the ServSafe textbook, and from certain years it's changed to different test companies, and I think it's back to ServSafe now. But when we learned about when we were learning about foodborne illnesses, and I first learned about Listeria, if you look at some of the symptoms, you could have a stillbirth or a miscarriage. So just imagine and the typical foods: raw milk, soft cheeses, vegetables, deli meats. So just imagine a woman that went to a deli to get a ham sandwich, and the ham wasn't refrigerated properly. The deli slicer could not have been cleaned every wash, rinse, and sanitized every 4 hours, how it's supposed to. And there could be a growth of Listeria. And if a woman could consume this sandwich, or even if you got a cheese sandwich that was sliced on the same slicer as the meat, and it was spread, and just the slicer's not clean, basically you could eat food. What you get from a deli one day could cause you to lose your pregnancy. And there's something about that stuck with me. I'm like, this This is no joke, and unfortunately, it does happen. And the the epidemiologist that works with my program, um, works with the inspectors, told me that's one of the saddest things to have to tell a family, um, that the reason why they got sick and lost their pregnancy was because of a ham sandwich. It's the craziest thing. It's just very sad. Salmonella. Basically, this is probably one that almost everyone, if you went to probably a first grade class today and you said, what makes you sick? People will say salmonella. Everyone knows salmonella. So salmonella, you have diarrhea, abdominal pain, fever, chills, could be vomiting. You know, it's from undercooked poultry. Now it's fresh produce. The way that you can handle is you just cook foods to proper temperatures. Shigella is similar to E. coli. We have the Streptococcus pyogenes. Basically, it's like a strep throat type thing. Apparently, scarlet fever can be a result, and you could get this from consumption of raw milk. And basically, to avoid it, you pasteurize your milk and make sure that your surfaces and equipment and hands and personal hygiene are clean. So here we go to the bacterial food intoxications. I mentioned earlier Clostridium botulinum. Symptoms: fatigue, weakness, double vision, slurred speech, respiratory failure, sometimes death. So it's an extreme neurological attack. There's different types. Type A and B are related to vegetables, fruits, meat, fish, and poultry. Type E is related to fish and seafood products, like a cold smoked salmon or lox that's not fully cooked, but it's vacuum packed. That could be at risk for certain types of botulism. And in general, fish, one of the biggest things that we look at, even when I first started with working with the state and was just learning, they taught us, especially when we're looking at imported products, if a whole fish is vacuum packaged without the gills being removed, then there is a high risk of botulinum toxin formation, essentially, because the spores are in the gills, so you need to remove them before you vacuum pack, because again, vacuum packaging takes the oxygen away, so that food typically just gets destroyed. You can't cook out toxins. So once the toxin is present, it's there. I mean, you could possibly with high pressure, but how we control it is to avoid the toxin formation, because once the toxin is there, you can't cook it out by normal methods. You wouldn't be able to cook it out. There's also an infant form of botulism, which typically happens if, this is why you're not supposed to dip a baby's pacifier in honey, because the spores can colonize in the intestines, and then you could have muscular weakness and some other symptoms. Perfringens is another one that, if food is left out too long in the temperature danger zone, so basically if you cook food, the temperature danger zone is between 135 and the low end is 41. So you want food to either be cold below 41 or hot above 135 degrees Fahrenheit. If you spend too much time above that and working your way down, maybe it cools to room temperature, then you heat it a little bit back up and you go back down, then there's an opportunity for the perfringens to grow out. And that is, it says here cooked meat and poultry, but it's also related to meat-based products, but things that typically hold like a thick product, that like a chili or a stew or even some gravies that are usually made in a large batch. So they're boiling when you cook them, then you turn the heat off, and then it sits at room temperature sometimes for too long. Or if you take that big pot and you put it in the refrigerator to cool down, it's not going to be cool from 135 to 70 within 2 hours, and then from 70 to 41 within an additional 4 hours. That's not going to happen. So you have this potential to grow out. All right. The big one that I want you to look at here is Bacillus cereus. If you look at cereus, you should think of cereal, and it's related to cereal grains like cooked rice and pastas. This is the reason, this bacteria is the reason that sushi rice has to be acidified or hot held. So when you go get your sushi rolls and the person making your sushi has their gloves on, they dig into usually it's still in the rice cooker or it's in a big container. They take out some rice, either push it onto the sheet, or they form it to put the fish on top. That rice has vinegar added. Now the vinegar does add flavor, but the vinegar is there to lower the pH. Lowering the pH increases the acidity. So when the acidity is high enough, Bacillus cereus does not have the opportunity to grow out and cause a problem. So here's our toxin-mediated infections. We have Campylobacter jejuni, and it's mainly, Campylobacter is basically, from when I learned it, it's basically on 65% of poultry. It's more common than Salmonella. It occurs more frequently than Salmonella, but not as many people know what Campylobacter is compared to Salmonella. So Salmonella is the one that's popular, but the symptoms are very similar. And then we have actually, let's go back to this one. So Escherichia coli. Raw or undercooked beef, raw milk. It could be from infected cattle, and to control for it is you cook the beef thoroughly. All of the, like the Vibrio cholerae is cholera. That's from human feces in the environment. Another E. coli is from human fecal contamination, and we know that feces or fecal matter is just poop. So somehow a sewage system does not work, and untreated sewage makes it into a waterway, and through one mechanism or another, you end up ingesting that. So that's one way that you could get sick. But here, this infected cattle, it's not necessarily the cattle. There's E. coli naturally in a cow's digestive tract. There's E. coli naturally in our digestive tract. Not all of them are pathogenic. I think there's 6 now. There was one added a few years ago, pathogenic E. coli, that we need to be concerned with. And again, pathogenic means harmful to us. So the way that E. coli gets introduced into food is that when the processor is breaking down the meat or cutting the meat, there's a full cow, and it's usually hanging by its back legs, and someone has a very large knife and they make their cuts and they try to process as much as they can, as quickly as they can. As they're processing it, sometimes you can slip and cut a part of the intestines, and we know what's in the intestines, that fecal material. So that fecal material ends up on the muscle meat, or on the muscle, which when it's alive, when the cow is alive, it's muscle. When it's being processed and broken down and put into a package, we think of it as meat. So the E. coli could be introduced from the fecal matter that was in the intestines onto the meat. As we move on, we already talked about Vibrio parahemolyticus and vulnificus. So what I just kind of described already is what this slide shows here. It's, pathogenic E. coli, and that's O157H7. That's one type, that's the most common type. So if the intestines are accidentally cut, fecal material containing pathogenic E. coli can be introduced to the muscle meat. And this is particularly of importance when we're talking about ground beef, because if we had a steak or a whole intact roast, what happens is the fecal material could be on the outside. Say we're talking about a steak. So a steak is a roast, a whole muscle section that's cut across. So whatever would be on the outside will be cooked and killed because it's exposed to the heat. It's exposed to either fire on the grill in this little diagram, or just exposed to heat. And then it'll be deactivated. But what happens when you take ground beef, like hamburgers, what happens is you take full intact muscle and then you put it in a grinder, and what's on the outside becomes on the inside, and it's all mixed up. So you need a higher cook temperature to make sure that you're reaching the center of this burger patty. You want to make sure that it's 155 degrees Fahrenheit in order to deactivate or have a 7-log reduction in the number of E. coli that could be present. So the issue with ground beef is that the outside becomes the inside. It's all mixed up, so you need to cook it to a higher temperature. So ground beef needs to be cooked to a higher temperature of 155 degrees than, say, a steak, which a beef steak, same animal, same muscle, that would only need to be cooked to 145 degrees. Okay. Again, we have some molds. Patulin is common it's related to apples. So long-term storage of apples, you can have a risk of patulin, and basically the apple just looks like it kind of almost turns to like a water balloon and then just pops on itself. It's not cool to see, and you definitely don't want to eat that. Again here, foods with molds generally should not be eaten, except for certain cheeses that without the molds you wouldn't have it. So blue cheese, that is injected. There's blue molds introduced to the cheese, and as it ripens, the mold grows out. So without molds, you wouldn't have the blue cheese. And soy sauce, I believe, is fermented with aspergillus. So if you didn't have the grow out, you wouldn't have soy sauce. So viruses, again, typically transferred via the oral fecal route or fecal oral route, which means there's poop and it's getting its way into your mouth. That's why it's so important for the people that prepare your food to wash their hands. And if it's ready to eat food that's already cooked, that's not going to be cooked again, to wear gloves. So wash your hands, put on gloves, or avoid bare hand contact for ready to eat foods to help stop the spread of viruses. And the main one in particular would be, you should be screaming it out right now, norovirus. So hepatitis A is also one of the viruses that we're concerned with, and that is usually contaminated water. That's one of the issues that we would be dealing with. But again, norovirus is the big one. That's the most popular. Well, I shouldn't say popular. It's the most prevalent, because there's definitely no one's voting for norovirus. There's no popularity contest there, but it is very prevalent and easily spread. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. Okay, so there's also food allergies and food intolerances. And there's a big difference between those. So people often confuse them or think that they can be used interchangeably. A food allergy means that you have an immune response. Sometimes that means you have an anaphylactic response where your throat will close and you need an EpiPen. I just was making the motion to stab myself in the leg with the EpiPen because that's often where it's administered. It's an immune response. An intolerance is not an immune response. It is typically a gastrointestinal response. You'll have diarrhea or vomiting, and you won't feel very good, but you're not going to go into anaphylactic shock over this. You're not going to break out in hives. Your throat's not going to close. It's not going to be hard to breathe, or should not be. That's the difference between the two. So, and it says here, food intolerance is related to an enzyme deficiency. So lactose intolerance, it's right there in the name. Lactose intolerance means that you cannot break down the sugar lactose because you do not have the enzyme lactase. So you should be learning this in the chemistry classes that you're either taking at the same time as this course or as a prerequisite to this course, that lactose, so lactose is the sugar, lactase, ase, is the enzyme that corresponds to lactose. So if you don't have the enzyme, you can't break down the sugar, and then you're going to have gastrointestinal issues. That is very different than a milk allergy, when you're allergic to the actual, you have an immune response to the proteins in the milk. One that's very confusing and often gluten intolerance or celiac disease is not, and it has to do with gluten, and gluten occurs in wheat and a few other products, but celiac disease and a wheat allergy are not the same thing. So we have labeling mandates on our products. There are different types of foods depending on what country you're in that may differ from our list here in the United States, but for us in the United States, and foods that are produced in the US or foods that are produced outside of the US that are labeled and sold and consumed in the US, they have to be labeled according to our standards. So there are 8 main allergens that require a declaration on a food label. There are way more than 8 allergens. I'm not saying that there are only 8, but these are, by case number, the statistically highest number of cases amongst the population in the United States, and these are the 8 that need to be declared on a label to alert someone with these allergens to avoid this product. So this is something that you definitely want to know. If you're not already aware of the 8 major allergens in the United States, you should pause the video, review the slides, put this information into your brain, etch it in there somewhere so that you can come back later to recall it. So we have tree nuts, which include almonds, coconut, walnuts, all the tree nuts, which are separate from peanuts. We have soy, eggs, milk, fish, wheat, and shellfish. Again, you need to know the US 8 major allergens. Don't worry about any of the others. You could look at them, but you, for this class, will need to know the 8 major allergens in the United States. Again, tree nuts, peanuts, soy, eggs, milk, fish, wheat, shellfish. Okay, moving along. So, jumping back, leaving the allergen and intolerance page, jumping back to foodborne illness. Many of the foodborne illnesses can be prevented by proper handling. So this little graphic from the author of the text shows us food as a vehicle for different types of foodborne illness. So food that is low, has a low acidity, has oxygen, has protein, and water. These are the foods that bacteria love because it's easy for them to get what they need from these foods. So what we need to do is try to control what we can. The easiest thing for us to control is temperature. So it says here for consumers, like your home refrigerator, 140 degrees. But in our class and ServSafe and in the world, especially as a regulator, and if you're working in food service, you need to know what the current food code guidelines are for the temperature danger zone. And that is 41 degrees Fahrenheit to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not as easy to remember as this one, but don't even put this one in your head. It's 41, so 41 and above, or above 41 and below 135. That temperature danger zone, you want to get foods moving as quickly through that as you possibly can. All right, so ideally you keep it below 41 or above 135. And reheat or cook and cool as quickly as you can. So you can manipulate the water as a means to reduce the likelihood of foodborne illness or spoilage. And that has to do with water activity. And there's a few videos posted for you to review to see what water activity really is. So it was discussed earlier in previous recordings. It's the A with the subscript W. So it is the amount of free water that's available. So in the example of making strawberry jam, if you add sugar, that water is no longer freely available for the bacteria to consume. Another thing is low acidity. So think of this like the sushi rice example. We add vinegar, which is highly acidic or has a low pH, to a food that has a high pH or low acid. So when you add that acid to that neutral food, you reduce the pH or increase the acidity of the rice. And that pH, typically sushi manufacturers are looking for 3.9 to 4.0 pH. When you get that low, Bacillus cereus will not grow in the rice. In terms of bacterial growth, what we're looking to do is slow it down, and time and temperature go together, because the growth of bacteria is exponential. So you can have 1 turns to 2 to 4 to 16, and it just keeps growing exponentially. Then you have a stationary phase if there's not enough food. So they grow logarithmically. And then there's a decline or death phase where there are so many that there's not enough food for them. That doesn't mean that the food becomes safe again. It's just there's so many bacteria that you're going to get ill. So what we try to do is, by controlling time and temperature, we cut it off, let's say here at this mark between at an hour, and then food is reheated, which is going to give us a 7 log reduction in the bacterial growth anyway, assuming that it was cooled properly. So we know this is an absolute. This is how bacteria grows. So we try to beat them at their own game by controlling time, temperature, and cooking things to the right temperature, cooling things to the right temperature and the right time. So cooling is basically done within 6 hours, but you have to, there's 2 checkpoints, 2 goals. The first one, or the cooling begins. So thinking back to that big pot of chili example, just imagine a huge pot of chili cooking on a stove. Usually it's cooking until it's boiling. You can see it bubbling, it's boiling, you put the thermometer and it's over 200 degrees. If you put that in a refrigerator at 200 degrees, it's just going to make everything else in the refrigerator warm. It's not going to cool down anyway. So what you're allowed to do is you could just turn off the stove and leave that at room temperature. What you should do is start to pan it out into shallow pans or smaller containers, and then basically like a 2-inch pan, you just fill up as many 2-inch pans as you can, put it on a rack, and you wheel the rack into the refrigerator, and then that will cool quickly. But cooling begins at 135 degrees Fahrenheit. So in a restaurant or food manufacturing facility, what I look for is I look to see that they're actually doing it and that they're recording the process. So the place would make their big pot of chili. Say they consider it to be done cooking at 10 a.m. Then so they would write 194 degrees 10 a.m. Then I would want to see the time that it reached 135. So they have to check it periodically so that when it gets to 135, that's when cooling starts. So they would write the time that the product was at 135, and then they have 2 hours to cool it down to 70 or below. And then once it hits 70, you have an additional 4 hours to get to 41 or below. So the first checkpoint, you have to get from 135 to 70 faster than you have to get from 70 to 41. And part of that is you can think about this logarithmic growth phase, but also think about this is just a way for you to help remember which part is faster. Our body temperatures are about 99 degrees, between 97 and 99, we'll say, the average person, right? So 135 degrees to 70 degrees, our temperature is right in that window. So the bacteria that can make us the most sick, we want to get the food past the bacteria that can make us sick love the temperature that we are. That's why they're dangerous to us. So if we get away from our temperature within 2 hours, then we have 4 hours to go the rest of the way. That's kind of a cheat to remember, that it's 2 hours from 135 down to 70, and then 4 hours to go from 70 down to 41. Okay, that pretty much sums up the review of this PowerPoint for food safety. Again, message me or send me an email if you have any questions, and I'll see you soon.